Today, I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Cory Barker to talk about his recent research of the pandemic's effect on the film industry. Hi, Dr. Barker. Thank you so much for joining me today. As we know, you've been researching how the pandemic has affected streaming services, social media, television. Can you tell me what has been your biggest finding so far?
Yeah, I think one of the things I was most interested in is at the early part of the pandemic, the film studios obviously had to reconsider how they were going to distribute films because theaters across the world were closing. And so they started in March, April, thinking about how to release films kind of directly to the home video market through iTunes, Amazon, streaming platforms. And I was really interested in how they promoted those things as a way to try to get people to pay $20 or $25 for a streaming rental, whereas they would usually pay, $6 when it came out a few months later or $12 at the theater. And the thing that I saw most commonly is an attempt to try to use social media as a way to create kind of a virtual community instead of being, in a movie theater with people and having that shared common experience of sitting down with popcorn and a soda. They were trying to use, social media promotion, especially on Twitter, to try to create kind of a feeling of collectivity, a feeling of community on social media, where they were encouraging people to rent and then, get online, get on Twitter and follow a hashtag, and everybody kind of hit play at the same time. And we're going to live tweet our commentary about these movies. And that was something that they really tried a lot of early in the spring, I think, because they thought that there were going to be opportunities to release bigger movies later in the summer, into the fall, now into the winter. And now that's clearly not the case. And so a lot of the studios have sort of dialed back that style of direct to iTunes or Amazon or Netflix release. And they've also minimized that kind of promotional strategy as well, because it seems like they're just saving films for theatrical release, even if that's a year or 18 months from now.
Right. So can you tell me, as a communication professor, why is this something that you were drawn to?
Yeah, a lot of my research is focused on how traditional media industries, film, television, news, are using tools like social media to promote, to brand themselves, to engage with audiences. And so I'm always, on the lookout for new or quasi new promotional strategies. And something like the pandemic obviously disrupted almost every, kind of level of Hollywood production, distribution, marketing. And so it was such a clear opportunity to look at things that were interesting and new and novel, that were kind of experiments. And I think a lot of times in studies of communication and media, we focus on the big things, the things that are popular or really influential. And a lot of my research tries to attend to things that are kind of temporary experiments or complete failures, or things that Hollywood and the media industries would rather we kind of forget about, because eventually those experiments kind of play into the things that they do down the road that are actually more successful and more popular.
So going on the fact of temporary issues, do you think this is something that's going to be temporary, or do you think that, the pandemic has hit us and now we're just in it for the long haul?
I think that's a great question. I mean, my answer to that keeps changing, because as we've gone through 2020, different studios have tried different things. So Disney made a huge deal out of releasing something like Mulan straight to Disney Plus, and not just, onto the platform, but you had to pay additional on top of your subscription fee. And so that appeared to be kind of a strategy that maybe the studios were going to pursue. And all indications are, and they don't really make this stuff completely public, but all indications are is that that was not a huge success. They might have made some money, but they certainly didn't make as much money as they would have had it been released, in the United States theatrically. And the fact that Disney has now paused any releases that are at that top level, all the Marvel movies, right, Pixar movies, those sort of things, and they're punting those until 2021 and 2022, that suggests that they realize that they can't just dump this stuff to streaming. I think we like to talk about streaming as the future. A lot of these media companies from a corporate level now have their own streaming platforms, and they want to drive consumers to those platforms because they know that's the future. But when you spend $300 million to make a movie, you can't really make that money up on a streaming platform or an iTunes rental. And so I think what we've learned is that the movie studios are just going to wait it out. The problem with that is all of the theater chains are now kind of left waiting in the wind, and they don't really have, they don't have a reason to draw people into the theater if no new movies are coming out, right? And it's kind of this endless cycle of there's no movies and people are scared, so they're not going. So there are no sales. So then the studios are like, why would we put out a new movie? Nobody's going. And then it just repeats the cycle again.
Right. So then how do you think these streaming services and the prices that are just racking up, how do you think that's going to affect our middle and lower class?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, one of the things I'm always thinking about, and I've been talking about this in interviews like this for years, is that we were in a time, 5 years ago, let's say, where it seemed like, okay, people are cutting the cord, they're not paying for cable, they're streaming everything, and it's this sort of digital streaming utopia where you can basically get everything you want on a couple of platforms. Now we're at a point where there are so many different platforms that if you want to watch one particular show or one particular movie, you might have to go to a platform that you don't have. And suddenly now you're, getting into a free trial or an additional subscription. And so the total cost to access the same level of content or the same amount of content is going up every year. And that's not even considering the fact that, platforms like Netflix keep raising their prices, right? They're going to raise their prices again here pretty soon, a couple of dollars, and that's going to just keep going. I think that they're pretty confident that they can charge people upwards of $20 a month with no question, right? And I think eventually Disney will increase the price of Disney Plus, and Warner will do the same thing with HBO Max. And so I think that will have an impact on people. I think eventually we're going to get to a point where people are going to have to make really strategic choices about, okay, I am just a Netflix subscriber and a Disney Plus subscriber, and anything else, you can tell me it's great or it's the best show or the best movie of the year, but I don't really care because I'm not going to pay an additional $18 a month just for that one show or that one movie. And so I think that creates, a real sort of hierarchy of platforms where something like Netflix has so much built-in equity, people have used it for years, that all people, no matter kind of what their class status are probably going to stick with things like Netflix and probably Disney Plus because it has that intense brand recognition. And all these other platforms are going to have to try to appeal to people who are super media consumers, right? If you're a really big fan of a certain franchise, maybe you'll use that streaming platform. But I think eventually we're going to get to a point where somebody's going to try to bundle all these things back together and charge, $50 for all of them in some ways. And that will be an interesting kind of pivot point to where we are now, where there's so many platforms and it's hard for people to keep up, let alone afford them.
Right. I do wish that was an option. I hope it's something that they're considering in the future. But I'm going to give you one more last question. And that is going to be, out of all of your research through all of this, what do you think is the most interesting thing that you've realized or found out?
I think that the most interesting thing that I always come back to is that a lot of these strategies that are pitched as new or disruptive, whether that's because the industry has come up with them on their own or because they're responding to things like a global pandemic, so often that stuff is framed as a brand new, novel, interesting way to promote or distribute. And in a lot of cases, it has some kind of historical parallel, right? There's always a connection back to something they've done before. Even the attempts to get people on Twitter to talk about The Invisible Man or the Trolls movie that came out in the spring. All of those strategies are very similar to what, TV networks have been doing for years, as opposed to as in trying to get people to live tweet episodes of Scandal or Survivor, whatever it may be, right? And so I think we like to think about these things as innovative and forward moving because that's the way the industry wants us to think about them. They want us to think about, futuristic progress and innovation and disruption, but it's a lot of the same stuff decade after decade, just kind of put in a new package. And that's always important to remember as someone who's studying these things and teaching these things, that we can make those obvious connections and not get caught up in the hype of this is the newest, coolest way to talk about a show or to stream or access a film.